Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Watershed. My name is Mark Cosgrove and I'm the cinema curator here at Watershed, and delighted to welcome you to this special screening of The Look of Silence. We're delighted to be presenting this screening in partnership with the Royal Anthropological Institute Ethnographic Film Festival. I'm delighted to have the producer of The Look of Silence and indeed the act of killing here tonight, Signe Sørensen, who's going to say a few words by way of introduction to the film, and then following it we'll be in conversation and also with exec producer André Singer.
Thank you, and thanks very much to RAI International Film Festival and to Watershed for inviting us and for screening The Look of Silence. I just want to say that the act of killing and The Look of Silence for us are two films that go together. You could say that The Look of Silence is accompanying the act of killing, but you could just as well say the other way around. And if you haven't seen the act of killing, it doesn't matter. You can see them one way or the other. But afterwards, I'm happy to talk about both of the film, their production story, and also about bringing both films out in Indonesia. Maybe I should also say I'm the producer of the two films, and often the producer is thought of as someone who smokes cigars and deal with the money. I don't smoke cigar, I do deal with the money, but I also was on location and part of the shooting of both the films, so you can ask whatever question you want also about the production on site. Thank you.
Please welcome back up on stage the producer, Signe Sørensen, and also the exec producer, André Singer. We've not got a huge amount of time, and I'm keen that if you want to ask questions, and obviously they can. But I've got a couple of questions just to sort of start things. But I think first of all, just to acknowledge what an extraordinary achievement that Signe is producer and Joshua is director, and the whole team involved for the two films, The Act of Killing and now The Look of Silence, which certainly for me are extraordinary achievements, which not only bear witness, but which also a testament to the power of film to be a witness and be part of this sort of process. So, I mean, I want to say congratulations, but congratulations doesn't seem quite the right word, but huge respect for everybody involved in the project, in the film. And it is an extraordinary achievement. I think in lots of ways the films are extraordinary achievements. But they're very practical things which have been made. And I wonder, Signe, if you can just give us a sense of, some of the practicalities that were involved in the films, and maybe with emphasis on The Look of Silence that we've just seen.
Well, maybe I should start by explaining that obviously you don't get this close to a family unless you spend a lot of time. And Joshua Oppenheimer, the director, and his collaborator at the time, Christine Sin, they came to Indonesia all the way back in 2001 and did a film on a plantation in North Sumatra. That's where they met Adi and Adi's family in the first time round. And this film was a participatory project with plantation workers doing a film about globalization. And the idea was to use this film all around the world for other people in unions around the world to talk about globalization. And that's where they discovered that these things had happened in 65, 66. And they discovered this because people in this plantation were scared of being in a union, exactly because they had family members who had been killed or imprisoned for being involved in union work in the 60s. So that's how they found the story in the first place. And then when they finished that film in 2003, just wanted to make a film with survivors to tell the story of how these people on this plantation had experienced the atrocities in the 60s. and he started filming with Artie and other people around this place, but it was still too close to the end of the dictatorship in '98, and people were too scared, and there were also police hanging around, military people, the crew got arrested, so it was very clear that it was impossible to tell this story at that time. And then they sort of sat down and thought, how can we tell this story? Before he went home, he thought, is there any other way we can tell this story? And one of the people suggested to him, why don't you film the perpetrators? They are boastful, they will tell about everything, and they also are the ones who know what actually happened. They did the killing, so they know exactly what happened to our family members in this place. So if you talk to them, we can find out about this, and we can maybe show the world how they are sort of still in charge and defining everything in the way that they want. And of course, that was a difficult thing to. First, he thought, I mean, how can I go and do that? And one of the first perpetrators he met was the guy who was singing in the beginning of The Look of Silence. And he realized that if he just sort of stood outside people's house and asked, what did you do when you were younger and so on, these perpetrators would automatically start telling about this time, because this had been where they got the power that had sort of brought them up in the world for the rest of their life and career and so on. And because they were still very proud of it, because that had been the discourse in Indonesia ever since, that this was good, this was great, we got rid of the communists. And so he started to try and find out, okay, so what happened exactly in this area, and map the whole sort of what is the chain of command. And he filmed with about 40 perpetrators before he met Anwar inside the city of Medan, which was the nearest biggest town and where the power structure was. And so that was in 2005. So when he met Anwar, he had actually filmed with more than 40 perpetrators already. And some of them are the ones that you see in the archive material in The Look of Silence. And then from 2005 till the act of killing was finished in 2012, and I think we filmed the last time all together for both films in the beginning of 2012. Then the last part of, or what's the main part of The Look of Silence, was filmed in 2011 and 2012, because at that time we had finished editing The Act of Killing, but it hadn't come out, and we knew we had to come back and film this material for The Look of Silence before The Act of Killing came out, because after that it would be more risky. So it's a film that sort of has a huge, long time span, but the archive material is from 2003, 2005, and the rest is 2011 and 12. But we could never have done the rest. We could never have done the main part of the film had we had just not filmed with all these perpetrators before. And there was also that material, because Artie saw that first material, especially what we call the river walk, where they sort of, Amir Hassan and Inong, they walk down to the river and they start talking about Ramli's death. That was also what Artie saw and what inspired him to say, I want to meet these guys, because he had been following both Doss's filming in the countryside, but also everything that had been going on with Anwar and the people in Medan. So that's just to give a little bit of the history.
For those who haven't seen the Act of Killing, Anwar was the main perpetrator character in that film. He wasn't in this film. So.
And André, question for you, which is just say a bit about how you got involved, because you're credited as executive producer, but also as president of the Royal Anthropological Institute. Where do these films sit as, anthropological or ethnographic filmmaking?
Well, I mean, my involvement is small. I mean, I helped in the post-production process and helped position them in the UK and so on. But I was not involved in the filming and so on as Signe and Joshua. I find, I continue to find them absolutely extraordinary in that they are, I think I was saying earlier today, a microcosm. there's a courageous aspect in these films in as far as they don't try and tell a grand political story. They don't tell you the background of what was happening in Indonesia and in the plantation system that this all came out of. They are, I think, their supreme strength is that they are character-driven stories of individual human beings, basically like one would like to think like us. And I think the concern that one has about the act of killing is that you gradually see a man who is perfectly capable of murdering people in cold blood, and gradually you're sort of given a sense of he's a rather nice man, isn't he? And he plays with his grandchildren, and it's that kind of uncomfortable sense of what human beings are capable of, and trying to get, I think, beneath that surface. Now, with Addy, it's the opposite, the polar opposite, of course, because Addy is such he's clearly got such an inner strength and a sort of a gentleness at the same time. But again, it's a human story about somebody trying to get to grips with circumstances that we don't really understand. And I don't think, even at the end of the films, one doesn't really understand how people can do this and live next door. You know, the idea that they're neighbours, they're friends, they can confront each other, they talk to each other, and yet you know that they've murdered your father or your brother or your sister or your children. It's an extraordinary phenomenon. My interpretation of what is anthropological enough is very broad. I think it's anything that helps teach us about humanity, and anything that we can identify with is anthropology. And I don't have a rigid academic perception of that. So I find these essentially very anthropological, but narrowly focused.
Okay, thanks very much. Want to invite the audience to ask any questions. There's a question. There's a microphone going round, so if you just hang on a second. There's a question here and a question at the back.
Hello. I remember I heard Joshua talking last year, and he talked about when the act of killing came out, and in fact that it was received reasonably well in Indonesia, and there was live public screenings, and it started a debate about this topic. That was over a year ago. How has that gone on since then, and what are your expectations for The Look of Silence? And then the second part of this question is, now how do you think that this is going to play out for Addy being in Indonesia, and especially as he did not want to reveal who he was to a number of these people?
Yeah, maybe I should explain that the act of killing came out internationally in August 2012, and then we started bringing it out in Indonesia in the autumn right after. But before we did that, we had consultations with our Indonesian crew in Indonesia, and with human rights organizations and the National Commission of Human Rights and lawyers and others in spring 2012, planning the release. And we had a strategy for the act of killing, which we also have used for The Look of Silence, where we, in Indonesia, if you want to bring a film out in the cinemas, you have to submit it to the censorship board. And if you get no, or if they cut it and so on, and people screen it anyway, then they're doing something illegal. But if you don't want to bring it out in commercial cinemas, and you don't submit it, then they can screen it without them doing anything illegal. And so we've just handed out a lot of DVDs in Indonesia, and had organizations that had prepared screening guides and so on, screen it, students' organizations, human rights organizations, everyone. But before they started doing that, we also held a lot of screenings for the press. And for example, with the act of killing, there was a magazine called Tempo magazine, a political magazine, that decided to check, is Anwar in the act of killing, is he a special case, or can we, our journalists, find other people across Indonesia who talk like him? And they sent their journalists out, they found a lot of people like that, and the magazine published 75-page special edition with those testimonies, and with stories about the film. And that, together with the film coming out in closed screenings all across Indonesia, using the International Human Rights Day on the 10th of December as a starting point, and then getting more and more screenings going throughout the year after that, that helped create a discussion in Indonesia and helped also the press start writing about these events in 65, 66 in a completely different way. And that again paved the way for the Look of Silence, which had its international premiere in August 2014. And so it was a different environment that the Look of Silence was brought out in than what had happened with the act of killing. And again, we had consultations with our Indonesian crew and with Adi and his family. And we together, we all decided that they would move away from this area where you see them here to another place still in Indonesia, but a place far away. So the perpetrators you see here, they're powerful, but they're mainly powerful in that region. They're not national figures like the most powerful people you see in the act of killing. So everyone have so far thought this is the best solution. Adi was with us when we did the international release in Venice and Telluride in Toronto, and he's just been with Joss again around in the UK, and now they're out in other places of Europe presenting the film. So far, both him and the Indonesian crew have been comfortable with the release. And actually, when we had the premiere of The Look of Silence in Jakarta in the autumn last year, we could have it in collaboration with the Jakarta Arts Council and the National Commission of Human Rights, and we had 2 times 800 people in an audience, and Adi was there on stage taking questions, and our crew was saying, they were sending messages like frantically saying we didn't expect that this was actually possible in Indonesia in this decade. So I think a lot of things has changed. Also, this has also something to do with the general political climate in Indonesia. They got a new president and so on. So we were also lucky in that sense that those changes happened before the Look of Silence came out. And when we had the first big screenings with the International Human Rights Day in 2012, we had 30 screenings of the act of killing. In 2014, for The Look of Silence, we had 300 screenings on that day. And since that, we've had, I think, up to now about 1,400 screenings in all 34 provinces and in more than 116 cities. And all of this is organized by our Indonesian team, together with local organizations all around the country.
Do you get a sense from that response in Indonesia that these crimes will be looked at by the government and will be treated in a way?
No.
No.
I don't think so. I mean, I still think that would be such a huge change and shift. But the National Human Rights Commission actually published a huge report at the same time that we brought out the act of killing in 2012, and they were calling for a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and the government at that time scrapped their report. But they are still arguing and they are still fighting for this. I don't think that the chances they have are strong enough. But the fact that they are still there and the fact that they can have this debate in a different way is a kind of change. But of course, I mean, Indonesia is a country of 250 million people, and this process is something that will take a very, very long time. So these films can be a starting point, but the
films become part of evidence. They become part of testimony. They do become part of that process. So
some of the material was actually already evidence, because some people in the National Human Rights Commission had seen part of this material while we were still shooting, and they were referencing it in that report. But sure, it's now sort of a more public part of the debate, because more journalists have seen it and written about it openly. And also, when the act of killing was nominated for an Oscar, that also opened a window for more of those debates to take place, both a debate that we try to raise in the US about the US involvement in these events in Indonesia, and the documents that are still classified, which we call for a declassification of. And it also opened up in Indonesia so that there was a government spokesman a couple of days before the Oscars who sort of said, we recognize that these atrocities that have taken place, and it sounds like a small thing, but that was actually the first time they had talked about them as atrocities. So it did do something.
There's a question here. The microphone's just coming to you.
Hi, very interesting film, and the idea of collective amnesia, and in fact the fact that every documentation of civilization is in fact a documentation of barbarism and all that. But I was wondering, has there been any film by someone from Indonesia that has perhaps received this kind of an reception, or how have films that are being made by people from Indonesia be considered or not considered as documentation of evidence?
There are also other films, and our crew in Indonesia that are bringing out these films are also trying to gather those other films and use them in the screenings that they have. I don't think that I can think of any that has had this much of festival and release and so on outside of Indonesia. But there is one right now, I forget the title, but that is addressing the atrocities also, and was made some years before, but it didn't so far reach the same audience. But we should also say that I know that it's Joshua mainly, and now Adi also, and the rest of us from Europe who are representing the film. But these films could not have been made without all the Indonesians that were involved in both of the film, especially in the Indonesian co-director who's still anonymous. And we haven't brought them out in Indonesia; they have brought them out. We are just like the spokespeople.
André,
I was just going to say, I think Signe's being modest about the impact, because I do think that the press coverage, the fact that there was that example of the army officers showing it to the soldiers, I think it's become a discussion point. The thousands of people who have now seen it and talked about it, I think that's a huge political change, and it will be a snowball. It can't go back in the box. So I think this is one of the few examples that I can think of where film has actually had a significant impact on the political scene in the country. So I think you're modest.
We've got time for one more question, because it is getting late, and there's a question at the back. Yeah, we are recording it, so it's good if you get the mic, because.
Just a quick one. I was wondering, how did you prepare Adi to watch that footage?
Adi and Josh had been already working together. He was also, they got to know each other all the way back with the globalization tapes. So he was involved in both shooting and watching at the time, and then he also knew what Josh was doing. And Ramli, his brother, was like the key. The killing of Ramli was the key point for the killings. If anyone wanted to talk about this, they would talk about Ramli, because everyone knew that he had the way he had died, because there had been so many witnesses, because he managed to get away on that truck that night and 2 other people managed to escape, and then he was caught again, and it took the whole night before they killed him, right? So there's a grave for Ramli that you also see in the film, and where all the other people in this area who were killed were just taken, arrested one day. People, their families knew they had been put in prison, and then they had disappeared. But Ramli people knew about. So, and of course Adi knew that people knew about this. And then basically when Josh was shooting things, Adi was following and seeing material. And then there was, it's not in this film, but when Josh incidentally found out that Amir Hassan and Inong had been directly involved in Ramli's killing, of course that was tough, but he also felt he owed it to the family to show it, and he showed it to a bigger group, not just Adi alone, at one point, and they of course had strong reactions to it, all of it. But the things that they heard, they also knew, It's just that it had been suppressed for so long. So, and even in the family had been very, very difficult to talk about.
So I'm afraid time will defeat us all, and have to call it to an end there. But I would just like to say thank you very much for everything, and do pass on to Joshua and everybody involved in the productions of the films, because quite extraordinary achievements. And I think, as André said, the impact that these films is having and will have will continue. So thank you very much, Signe and André.
Thank you.